I always get a little awkward introducing Jimmy Stewart. There are so many things you can say. He does not need a...
Under the clean white lights of American television, where every laugh sounds rehearsed and every moment feels controlled, the most chaotic truths often came from the shadows behind the curtain. For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the immaculate face of late-night TV. Sharp, calm, perfectly composed. But that was only the surface. In the era before editing safety nets, before social media could bury a mistake, live television showed everything exactly as it happened. And sometimes, what happened was a Hollywood legend walking on stage, so drunk they could barely remember where they were or who Johnny Carson was. Tonight, we revisit 8 unforgettable moments, 8 live, irreversible disasters that pushed Carson's composure to its limit. Truman Capote. He appeared from behind the curtain, like a man stepping out of a fog he could no longer control. Truman Capote, one of America's sharpest literary minds, the author who carved in cold blood with surgical precision, took barely 6 uneven steps before the audience realized something was wrong. His gait was soft, unfocused. His eyes blinked too slowly. Even Johnny Carson, a man trained to read human behavior in seconds, leaned forward slightly, bracing himself for impact. Capote lowered himself into the guest chair as if gravity had suddenly doubled. When Carson opened with his standard, effortless greeting, "It's great to have you with us tonight, Capote," attempted a witty reply, but what emerged was a slurred, shapeless sound. Carson paused, tried again, repeated the question. The audience laughed nervously, not out of amusement, but out of discomfort. Capote's words drifted like loose paper in a weak wind, starting somewhere, losing their structure midway, and landing nowhere. As Carson gently tried to guide him back to coherence, his new book, his writing routine, anything, Capote slipped further. He launched into a broken anecdote involving Montgomery Clift, changed subjects 3 times in a single sentence, then suddenly turned to Ed McMahon and asked if he could sit in his lap, because you look soft, like a teddy bear. McMahon froze. The studio laughter this time was sharp, uncertain, and then came the water. Capote reached for his glass, missed it by an inch, dragged it across the desk, and spilled half of it onto his shirt. He blinked, continued talking as if nothing had happened, the stain spreading across his chest under the bright studio lights. Carson's face tightened, still polite, still composed, but unmistakably calculating an exit strategy. At minute 12, he found it, a forced smile. A quick glance to the stage manager. An early commercial break, something Johnny Carson almost never did, unless the show was slipping beyond recovery. Capote would never return. The moment became a quiet reminder that brilliance does not grant immunity. Even a mind as sharp as his could be swallowed by the very shadows he spent a lifetime trying to outrun. Shelley Winters. She entered the Tonight Show stage like a storm front, loud, unpredictable, and moving on a trajectory that no one, not even Johnny Carson, could control. Shelley Winters, the 2-time Academy Award winner, was known for her fierce talent and even fiercer personality. But on this particular night, the audience witnessed something else. A woman who had clearly been drinking long before the cameras rolled. From the first unsteady step, it was obvious something was off. Her hair and wardrobe were immaculate, but her eyes carried a haze that betrayed the truth. Carson hadn't even finished introducing her when Winters cut him off mid-sentence, launching into a story entirely unrelated to the autobiography she was supposed to promote. Her voice was loud, overstretched, occasionally slowing, as if she had momentarily forgotten her own point. Carson tried to maintain structure, but Winters refused to be contained. She spoke over his questions, interrupted every transition, and swatted away his attempts to return to the topic, like they were flies buzzing around her glass. Whenever Carson attempted to steer the interview back on course, she dismissed him with a wave. "Oh, Johnny, nobody cares about that. Let me tell you about Marlon Brando." The audience laughed, but not comfortably. They were laughing to fill the silence Carson couldn't control. Then came the next guest, a young actor, nervous, polite, eager for his first major Tonight Show appearance. Winters pivoted toward him, placed her hand on his knee, and announced that he was much prettier than his movie. Each time Carson tried to interview the young man, Winters smothered the moment, derailing the conversation before it could begin. And then it happened, the moment that froze the studio. Winters reached over, snatched Carson's stack of cue cards from his hand, and tossed them over her shoulder in a slow, theatrical arc. The cards scattered across the floor as the audience gasped. Carson's expression tightened. For a brief second, the unbreakable composure of late-night television's king visibly cracked. He did the only thing he could, cut to a commercial break far earlier than planned. Winters disappeared from the Tonight Show lineup for 3 years. When she eventually returned, It was under strict conditions, most notably a midday taping, strategically chosen to minimize the possibility of pre-show drinking. She remained a brilliant actress. But on Carson's stage that night, she was a hurricane, one that no amount of preparation could contain: Dean Martin. For years, Dean Martin carried a reputation that seemed almost engineered for late-night television, the charming crooner with a martini in one hand and a joke in the other. His tipsy gentleman persona was part of the act, a crafted illusion supported by rumors that his glass often held apple juice rather than liquor. It was a performance smooth, controlled, and perfectly aligned with the relaxed swagger that made him a star. But on one night in 1976, the act stopped being an act. From the moment Martin stepped through the Tonight Show curtain, something felt wrong. The familiar, practiced sway had turned into a stumble. His eyes, normally sharp with mischief, drifted unfocused across the studio. As he sat down, he nearly missed the chair entirely. Carson greeted him with warmth. Old friends reunited, but the warmth quickly shifted into concern. Carson opened with the usual softball question about Martin's upcoming NBC special. Martin blinked, stared blankly, and asked, "What special?" Carson tried again, more gently this time. Martin looked confused, then said, "Oh, I thought I was here to talk to Merv." He had confused The Tonight Show with a completely different program. The audience laughed at first, thinking it was part of the act. But the laughter faded when Martin didn't smile, didn't wink, didn't offer the sly correction he usually delivered when playing the drunk bit. He simply slumped back, quiet, lost inside his own fog. Carson attempted to redirect him with safer topics: golf, Rat Pack memories, Vegas performances. Each time, Martin struggled. At one point, he began singing Everybody Loves Somebody, only to stop midway and ask if the show was live. At another, he looked around the studio and asked, "Is Sammy coming?" even though Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't scheduled. Carson's face revealed what the audience was now realizing. This wasn't a routine. This was a man unraveling in real time. After 7 painful minutes, Carson did the merciful thing. He thanked Martin, cut to commercial early, and quietly motioned for a production assistant to help him off stage. The camera lingered just long enough to catch the worry in Carson's eyes. Dean Martin had spent his career making drunk look elegant. On that night, the elegance slipped. And behind the facade of a beloved entertainer, viewers glimpsed the quiet grief and private battles he had long kept hidden. Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr was not the kind of man viewers expected to see unravel. To millions, he was Perry Mason, the unshakable attorney who never lost a case, the embodiment of discipline, dignity, and moral certainty. His voice carried authority. His posture radiated control. If there was one celebrity the Tonight Show staff assumed would never create chaos, it was Burr. Which is what made his 1,970 appearance so shocking. Trouble began before he ever reached the stage. Burr arrived at NBC nearly 40 minutes late, forcing Carson's team to reshuffle the entire rundown. When he finally stepped backstage, the truth became impossible to ignore. His tie hung slightly off-center, his hair looked oddly mussed, and his face carried a deep, unmistakable flush. He was drunk visibly, heavily drunk. Carson was informed seconds before Burr walked through the curtain. For a moment, he considered canceling the segment, but sending home a star of Burr's stature would have created a different kind of disaster. So he took his position, straightened his papers, and waited for the contradiction of Perry Mason to reveal itself. It didn't take long. Burr gripped the back of the guest chair as if steadying himself against a sudden gust of wind. When Carson asked the most harmless question, "What are you working on now?" Burr launched into a 10-minute monologue about his orchid collection in Fiji. He described greenhouse temperatures, crossbreeding, and soil composition with the devotion of a botanist, not an actor. None of it had any connection to Carson's question. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Carson tried again, gently. Burr did not follow. His words slurred, his thoughts scattered, and he kept losing his place, restarting sentences without realizing he had already spoken them. Then came the moment that froze the room. When Carson attempted to bring the conversation back to Perry Mason, Burr stared at him for several silent seconds and asked, with complete sincerity, "What did you say your name was again?" The audience laughed briefly before the silence swallowed the studio. Carson recovered quickly, extending his hand with a stiff smile. "Johnny Carson. Nice to meet you, Mr. Burr." It was both a joke and a rescue. When the segment ended, Burr was quietly escorted off stage. Carson later remarked, "He went from courtroom legend to cocktail liability in one night." For viewers, the shock lingered. The man who once represented absolute control had exposed a truth far more fragile: Orson Welles. Orson Welles did not stumble onto the Tonight Show stage, he commanded it, even when he was drunk. Unlike other guests whose intoxication exposed their vulnerability, Welles wore his like a strange kind of armor. The great director of Citizen Kane, the larger-than-life raconteur, with a voice carved from thunder, entered the studio in 1975, flushed, sweating, and unmistakably under the influence. Yet he carried himself with the confidence of a man convinced that brilliance could outshout sobriety. Backstage sources said he had consumed multiple bottles of wine before arriving. By the time he reached Carson's desk, the signs were clear: the heavy breathing, the damp forehead, the slight difficulty lowering himself into the reinforced guest chair The Tonight Show had built just for him. Carson opened his mouth to ask the first question, but Welles never gave him the chance. He launched into a monologue. Not a ramble, not chaos, but a dense, winding lecture on Shakespeare's problem plays, delivered with the authority of a professor and the unpredictability of a man walking a tightrope after midnight. His words occasionally slurred, but his ideas, when they held together, glowed with the remnants of his extraordinary mind. The audience didn't know whether to admire him or fear for him. Carson mostly stayed silent, hands folded, eyes tracking Welles like a man watching a fire. Beautiful, dangerous, and utterly beyond control. When Welles attempted to quote King Lear and couldn't remember the lines, he simply invented new ones, flawless Elizabethan phrasing, delivered with booming conviction. The scholars watching at home likely winced. The average viewer never noticed. The performance was outrageous, mesmerizing, and undeniably sad. The monologue stretched on for 14 uninterrupted minutes. Carson shifted in his chair, his expression cycling through fascination, exhaustion, and mild desperation. When Welles finally paused to sip water, a Herculean effort, Carson glanced at his watch and said, "With a rare lack of polish, we need to take a break." Backstage, he reportedly sighed. The genius was there. The sobriety wasn't. And yet, unlike others who stumbled on his stage, Carson kept inviting Welles back, because even drunk, Orson Welles remained what so few guests ever were: impossible to predict and impossible to ignore. Zsa Zsa Gabor. Zsa Gabor entered The Tonight Show studio in 1973, exactly as America expected her to. Wrapped in diamonds, draped in glamour, carrying herself with the exaggerated grace of a woman who always knew where the cameras were. But on this night, something in her walk wavered. One stiletto heel caught slightly on the carpet. Her balance shifted. Johnny Carson rose to greet her, not out of formality, but instinct. The moment she leaned in to kiss him and missed his cheek entirely, landing somewhere near his ear, the tone of the interview changed. Gabor settled into the guest chair with a laugh too loud for the moment. Her accent, usually thick but controlled, now rolled into near indecipherable syllables. Carson adjusted. He shifted to simple questions, hoping she could anchor herself. But Gabor insisted on long, wandering answers that abandoned their own beginnings and arrived nowhere in particular. And then she began inching closer. Mid-sentence, she slid across the couch toward Carson, forcing him subtly toward the opposite armrest. "Johnny," she purred, "you are trying to make the moves on me," projecting the line to the audience as though she were delivering a performance on stage rather than sitting on a talk show. Laughter erupted, partly amused, partly anxious. Carson held his composure, but his movements grew tighter, his smile more strained. When he introduced a book about Gabor's famous sisters, hoping to pivot toward something structured, she ignored it entirely. Instead, she thrust her jeweled wrist toward the camera and declared, "Look at this bracelet, Dolink worth more than the entire NBC building." She dissolved into her own laughter before Carson could respond. Moments later, she leaned in, placed a hand on his knee, and whispered loud enough for millions to hear, "Why talk about boring books when we could discuss your bedroom?" Carson froze. The audience howled. Yet beneath the noise, an unmistakable tension pulsed across the stage. The breaking point came when Gabor attempted to stand for dramatic effect, only to lose her balance. A stagehand lunged forward. Carson caught her arm. Disaster was a breath away. He ended it. A quick thank you, a tight smile, a hand signal for commercials. Backstage, Carson summed it up in 7 words. She came for charm, but vodka showed up first. For the Tonight Show staff, it became protocol. Book Zsa. Zsa. Early in the day, the only way to outrun her nightlife, Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed never needed a stage to cause chaos. He carried it with him into studios, onto sets, through interviews, across continents. By the early 1970 seconds, he had already earned a reputation as one of the most unpredictable men in the entertainment industry, a volcanic mix of brilliance, bravado, and alcohol. And yet, unlike every other name on this list, Oliver Reed never actually made it to Johnny Carson's couch. That absence alone speaks volumes. Reed was booked. The Tonight Show staff scheduled him to promote The Three Musketeers, expecting the same rugged charisma he brought to the screen. But days before taping, warning signs began arriving in NBC's mailroom in the form of videotapes from other talk shows, each one worse than the last. On the BBC's Parkinson, Reed had performed an impromptu gymnastics routine before insulting the host. On the Russell Hardy Show, he famously poured a glass of whiskey into a potted plant, declaring the drink too weak to offend a child. And on Australian television, after being pressed about his drinking habits, Reed threatened to remove his trousers live on air and began to make good on the promise before producers cut to commercial. These clips reached Carson. He watched them quietly. Then he asked a simple question. Can I control that on live television? The answer, clearly, was no. Carson made a rare decision. He canceled the booking outright. Reed took the rejection personally. He told reporters that American television was too timid and that Carson was afraid of a real man on his precious show. But behind the dramatics was a truth that even Reed's fiercest defenders couldn't deny. He drank with a dedication that felt less like indulgence and more like compulsion. When alcohol mixed with his natural volatility, the result was explosive. Carson wasn't afraid he was experienced. He understood the limits of live television, and Reed existed outside those limits. The Tonight Show staff later called him the guest too wild even for Carson. It was not an insult, it was a boundary, and perhaps, in a strange way, a kindness. Because Reed wasn't just battling interviewers, he was battling himself. And late-night television had no safety net for a man collapsing in real time. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole didn't stumble into The Tonight Show. He arrived gliding with the elegance of a classically trained actor, even when heavily lubricated by what he famously called a proper lunch. For O'Toole, a proper lunch meant one thing: an afternoon of uninterrupted scotch. By the time he reached Carson's studio in 1978 to promote Caligula, he was already glowing with that unmistakable warmth of a man for whom alcohol was both companion and curse. Yet, when he stepped through the curtain, he looked composed, too composed, and that was the danger with O'Toole. He held his liquor with the poise of a stage lord, masking the chaos beneath it. Carson welcomed him. O'Toole bowed slightly, then launched into a critique of the studio lighting before Carson had finished his first sentence. The audience laughed. Carson didn't. Then the interview derailed completely. O'Toole embarked on a 7-minute lecture about the decline of classical acting, quoting Greek dramatists, Victorian theater critics, and his own mentors, with perfect, booming diction. It was impressive until it wasn't. Mid-sentence, he would pause, eyes drifting, forgetting where he was, only to snap back with a razor-sharp observation, as if his mind had briefly wandered into darkness and returned carrying treasure. Carson attempted a pivot. Let's talk about Caligula. O'Toole ignored him. Instead, he seized Carson's pen from the desk, stood up abruptly, and assumed a perfect fencing stance. "Stand up, Johnny," he commanded, voice echoing like a Shakespearean king, addressing a terrified court. "I shall teach you the noble art." Carson hesitated, then rose, partly amused, partly concerned. And so, in front of millions, Peter O'Toole gave a 3-minute fencing lesson using a ballpoint pen as a foil. "Lunge with conviction," he ordered. "Parry as though your virtue depends on it." The audience roared, while Carson tried not to get stabbed by a drunk but impeccably trained actor. When they finally sat again, O'Toole veered into a story about a 3-day drinking marathon with Richard Harris that ended with temporary possession of a racehorse. By this point, Carson had surrendered all control. He became a spectator, smiling, nodding, and occasionally blinking, as if trying to remember that he was still hosting his own show. And yet, unlike many drunken guests, O'Toole was never banned, because, even at his drunkest, he remained what The Tonight Show valued most: magnetic, articulate, dangerously alive. A man whose genius flickered, but never fully dimmed, no matter how thick the fog around him became. In the polished world of late-night television, audiences were trained to believe in perfection. The lighting was flawless. The laughter was timed. The host was unshakable. But the 8 moments we've just revisited tell a different story. A quieter, darker truth hiding beneath the choreography of American entertainment. When a guest walked onto Johnny Carson's stage drunk, the illusion cracked, and in that crack, something human slipped through. Truman Capote mumbling through genius gone dim. Shelley Winters devouring the show like a storm with its own gravity. Dean Martin losing the delicate balance between performance and pain. Raymond Burr collapsing under the weight of an image he could no longer carry. Orson Welles wielding brilliance like a sword, dulled at the edges by wine. Zsa Zsa Gabor turning chaos into glamour and nearly toppling with it. Oliver Reed so unpredictable, he never even made it to the couch. And Peter O'Toole, the eloquent warrior, fencing with a pen while drowning in scotch. Each moment was messy, uncomfortable, sometimes humiliating, but they were also unfiltered, unedited, real in a way modern television rarely allows. In an age before digital fixes and public relations lifelines, The Tonight Show captured the truth exactly as it happened. If a legend stumbled, the world watched. If a star forgot their lines, their name, or their sobriety, there was no safety net waiting in the wings. Johnny Carson understood that better than anyone. Night after night, he became the quiet center of the storm, absorbing chaos, protecting guests from themselves when he could, and letting silence speak when he couldn't. His composure wasn't just professionalism. It was compassion disguised as comedy, control, masquerading as ease. He knew something essential. Fame polishes people until they shine, but alcohol strips them back down to the vulnerable shape underneath. And that was what viewers saw, in those moments, fragments of humanity slipping through the cracks of celebrity. 50 years later, the tape still feels raw. The laughter still sounds nervous. The silences still sting, because beneath the glamour of old Hollywood, beneath the jewels, the monologues, the perfect sets, something truer was always waiting to surface. Live television can fake many things. Sobriety isn't one of them.